The mystery housemaid. In the lively city of Owerri, there lived a very successful woman named Mrs. Grace. She was a hard-working career woman with a big job in a famous company. Every day, she woke up earlier and left the house before the sun came up. She always wore fancy suits, carried her leather handbag, and drove a shiny car. Mrs. Grace had a big smile on her face, but her heart was heavy with worry. She had a lovely husband named Mr. Daniel and two little children, David and Marvelous, but she never seemed to have time for them. She was always too busy with meetings, traveling, and her important work. Because she was always at work, Mrs. Grace hired a young maid named Amaka to help her at home. Amaka was beautiful, with bright eyes and long flowing hairs. She came from a small village and was full of life and energy. At first, she was very quiet and did her work with care. She would clean the house, cook tasty meals, and take care of the children. Mrs. Grace was happy to have Amaka in her home, thinking she could trust her completely. She thought Amaka would make things easier for her family. But as time passed, things began to change. Amaka saw that Mr. Daniel was often alone, feeling lonely because Mrs. Grace was never home. Mr. Daniel would sigh deeply when he thought no one was looking, and he often sat in the living room by himself. Amaka noticed this and felt an idea forming in her mind. She thought, if Mrs. Grace is never here, maybe I can make Mr. Daniel love me instead. Amaka started to dress in a prettier clothes, using a bit of Mrs. Grace's perfume when no one was watching. She began to smile at Mr. Daniel in a special way, speaking softly and gently whenever she served him his food. At first, Mr. Daniel paid no attention, but Amaka was determined. She started to cook his favorite meals, like spicy jollof rice and jollof chicken, and left sweet notes by his breakfast saying, "Enjoy your meal, sir." Mr. Daniel started to feel special, something he hadn't felt for a long time. One evening, Mrs. Grace came home late from work, tired and hungry. She saw Amaka sitting close to Mr. Daniel on the sofa, laughing and talking in a way that made her heart skip a beat. She tried to ignore it, but she felt a cold feeling creeping up her back. She told herself, Amaka is just being friendly, and went upstairs to take a shower. Days turned into weeks, and Amaka's behavior grew bolder. She started giving orders in the house as if she were the madam. She would say, "This is how Mr. Daniel likes his tea," or "You don't know how to arrange his clothes properly. Let me do it." Mrs. Grace noticed, but she was too tired and too busy to say anything. She thought, "I trust Amaka. She knows what she's doing." Little did she know, Amaka was slowly taking over her home. One day, Amaka prepared a special dinner for Mr. Daniel. She wore a beautiful dress, one of Mrs. Grace's old ones she found in the closet. When Mr. Daniel came home, he saw the table set with candles and Amaka standing there smiling sweetly. "What is this?" he asked, surprised. Amaka replied softly, "I thought you deserved a special meal just for you." Mr. Daniel felt filtered, and from that day, he began to spend more and more time with Amaka. They would talk and laugh, and soon, Mr. Daniel found himself thinking of Amaka even when she wasn't around. Mrs. Grace began to feel something was wrong. She would hear Amaka speaking rudely to her, saying things like, "Why are you never around, madam? Don't you care about your husband?" Mrs. Grace tried to ignore it, thinking Amaka is just young. She doesn't understand, but deep down, she felt hurt. She wanted to spend time with her family, but her work kept pulling her away. She was caught in a trap and don't know how to get out. One day, Mrs. Grace decided to come home earlier, hoping to surprise her family. As she opened the door, she heard laughter coming from the living room. She saw Amaka sitting on Mr. Daniel's lap, her head resting on his shoulder. Her heart broke into pieces. "What is going on here?" she shouted, her voice shaking. Amaka stood up slowly and said with a snore, "Oh, you are finally home, madam. Too bad, we were having such a good time without you." Mrs. Grace turned to Mr. Daniel. "How could you do this to me?" she cried. But Mr. Daniel looked away, ashamed, but also confused. He had fallen into Amaka's trap and don't know how to get out. From that day, the house became a place of mystery for Mrs. Grace. Amaka continued to act like she owned everything. She would make slick comments saying, "Maybe if you were a better wife, your husband wouldn't be so lonely." Mr. Daniel, now under Amaka's spell, began to treat Mrs. Grace. He would shout at her for small things and even started to raise his hands at her. He had never done this before, but Amaka was always whispering in his ear, filling his mind with lies. The children, David and Marvelous, were confused and sad. They missed their happy family, and they could see that their mother was. One day, little Marvelous asked her mother, "Mommy, why does Amaka act like she is our new mommy?" Mrs. Grace did not know what to say. She hugged her daughter tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. Finally, Mrs. Grace realized she had to take action. She could not let Amaka destroy her family. She called a family meeting. She sat down with Mr. Daniel and said firmly, "This must stop. Amaka has no right to come between us." But Mr. Daniel, under Amaka's spell, shouted back, "You were never here for us. You never cared. Maybe Amaka is right. Maybe you are the one who should leave." Mrs. Grace felt like her heart shattered again, but she gathered her strength and said, "No, I will not leave my home. I will fight for my family." She decided to spend more time at home. She started cooking meals again, spending time with the children, and talking to Mr. Daniel, trying to remind him of the love they once shared. And many times she felt like giving up, but she kept going. One day, Mrs. Grace found Amaka in her bedroom, wearing her clothes and putting on her makeup. "Get out of my room," she shouted. But Amaka laughed. "This is my house now," she replied. Mrs. Grace knew this was the last straw. She had to take control. She fired Amaka on the spot, telling her to pack her things and leave. At first, Mr. Daniel was angry, but slowly as the days passed, he began to see clearly again, without Amaka's whisper in his ear. He remembered how much he loved his wife and his family. He apologized to Mrs. Grace, saying, "I am sorry for everything. I let myself to be." Mrs. Grace forgave him, but she knew things would never be the same. She learned a very important lesson that day. She learned that no matter how busy life gets, a woman must never forget to take care of her home and set boundaries. She must never allow anyone, not even a housemaid, to take care of her role in the family. And so, Mrs. Grace decided to make a change. She began to balance her work and her home better. She spent more time with her children, showing them love and care. She set clear rules for anyone who came into her house, never allowing another Amaka to come in and cause problems. To all the married women reading this story, remember, never forget to set boundaries in your home. Never allow anyone, not even a housemaid, to take over your responsibilities. Love your family, take care of your household, and make sure you are always there for your children. A family is like a garden. It needs time, care, and love to grow. And as for Amaka, she learned a hard lesson too. She realized that no matter how much you try to take what isn't yours, it will never bring you happiness. She left the house, and no one ever heard from her again. The end. Thank you guys for watching my story, and please come back for more stories. I love you.